We're in your world history book in chapter 19. We're going to talk about America and the age of industry. This is the last part of the chapter. The United States rising to power, a new world power, and the blessings of a free market and capitalism. In some of these pictures here, you can see Wall Street here, and this woman here I'll be talking about, Hattie Green. She was actually one of the greatest misers in history. But anyway, let's keep going. The United States rises to power, economic freedom, and prosperity. In 1800s, the Industrial Revolution reached America, but not until after the Civil War in 1861 to 1865 that the industrial boom occurred in America. America's wealth increased from $7 billion to $88 billion. The gross national product, which is the total output of goods and service, increased by 44% between 1874 and 1883. Capitalism. Let's talk about that. Capitalism, another word for capitalism would be the free enterprise system of the economic system. Now, when you think of capitalism, I remember back when in the history books, I always thought of something as a negative thing. But all capitalism means is that you have capital to do business, and instead of the government having your capital to do business, the tools for your business are those things you have are your capital. So capitalism meaning private ownership of means of production means that private people have the means to produce things. Investments are determined privately rather than by the state or the government. Prices, production, and distribution of goods are determined by a free market rather than by a government or a state market. And this allows freedom for people to follow their economic pursuits, their American dream. And many people came to America for this American dream to better themselves financially. Free enterprise brought liberty, that's liberty, freedom, and responsibility. With freedom becomes responsibility. The individual was free to make something of himself if he had the energy and initiative to do it. And people had to accept the responsibility for their own welfare. This meant less government involvement. America had a unique blend of people with high moral character, with the will to work, and the greatest degree of individual responsibility and freedom the world has yet seen. This included new inventions, great natural resources, large labor supply, surplus capital, cheap transportation. America was indeed blessed and bountiful. And America being that new world power, that we had defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1898. The former Spanish colonies of Cuba and Philippines, and took responsibility for their independence. And then the Panama Canal greatly expanded the American world in the influence in the Western Hemisphere and in the Pacific. The benefits of capitalism, the rise of big business. The greatest financial age mankind has ever seen happened during this time. Big business, new forms geared to the development of giant manufacturing occurred. Supersized corporations controlled certain areas of industry, and these industrial giants became super rich. We have some of these industrial giants, including John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, onto J.P. Morgan here, and Cornelius Vanderbilt over here in this section, and onto Henry Ford there. So you see their pictures. John D. Rockefeller lived in 1839 to 1936, and he became rich in the oil industry. In fact, he started off, all of these guys started off almost in poverty and then became super rich. So when I say oil, he was in Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller actually was a Baptist. He was a Christian, but during his becoming so rich, he had a lot of anxieties and stuff. In fact, he had alopecia, lost all of his hair, and just everything that happened to him. And later on, his son actually had taken over and kind of joined in with Freemasons and a few other things. But anyway, and on to Andrew Carnegie. He too, he was a bobbin boy in the factories. He ran and got the bobbins for the sewers, and he made like $1.20 a week, you know. So, and then he became a secretary to the railroad industry, and he invested his money into steel, and he became probably the richest man in history. Carnegie here. Carnegie, thing about Carnegie, he wasn't a Christian. In fact, he was against Christianity. He was an atheist and an evolutionist and also a Freemason. So he's like, okay, even though he had some good idea, and Carnegie gave away almost all of his money to charity. So, and on to Henry Ford, and we know Henry Ford and the automobile, and he too, when he grew up, he never even went to high school, but he was a genius at putting like watches together and taking them apart and those kind of things. And then he went on to invent put together these different engines and onto the automobile industry, and basically that industry where they would produce mass on the assembly lines. And he also was good to his employees. He had them profit sharing with them, and also he made so they would work so long. He only had a 40-hour week work ethic. So he had a lot of work ethic. But later on, bad thing about him was that he later on in his life, he was very anti-Semitic against the Jews, thinking he read some things that were not exactly true, and he had this magazine that he wrote, and a lot of it was anti-Jewish people. So anyway, that's just a tidbit to know. And then J.P. Morgan, as you see, J.P. Morgan, he was the only one here that probably came, his father was a wealthy banker. In fact, even went to Europe, was in his banking, and it was associated with the Rothschilds back there, were the richest people in America. But as J.P. Morgan, he was a very sickly boy, and he actually, spent most of his time looking at art and maybe music, and you wouldn't think he'd be this great banker, but as he went through, he did a lot of bought up a lot of different companies. He became super, super rich. In fact, they always say that probably J.P. Morgan saved America from 2 banking panics that happened, and I'm not sure about all of that, because it's kind of a conspiracy theory that possibly the panics were started by the bank at the reserve, and that led to the Federal Reserve Bank, which was banking outside of the country, but it would take a while for me to go over all that. But J.P. Morgan, and then the Vanderbilts, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was in the shipping and railroad. He was a very rough individual. He became rich, as for starting out, he was just, basically transporting people in a boat across the water. What would you call that? Basically the shipping industry, but his thing was basically transporting people, and he ended up transporting people on the railroad clear across from New York all the way to San Francisco during the gold rush in California. So he became extremely rich. He was very scrupulous. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not a Christian, especially at the end of his life. He was actually into seances and witchcraft and stuff like that. So I would not say that he was a Christian. So these were the guys of capitalism, some of the big business, and they would also call them robber barons, because a lot of people thought that they basically had exploited a lot of their workers in that situation, and monopolies monopolies on business back then. So, which led to having unions and such, and also to being what you call them, to stop the monopolies. So we'll get into that later on. That would take me another video. And then we have Hattie Green. Hattie Green was was basically such a miser. She was the richest woman, but she wouldn't turn on her heat because she was saving money in her house, and some of the things she'd only eat oatmeal and onions and eggs. And her son, he got hurt and got an infection in his leg, and she wouldn't take him to the doctor because she thought it was too expensive. He ended up getting his leg amputated. So, but she made millions of dollars, let's just say that, and from basically doing the stock market and stuff at that time. So let's go on. Successful entrepreneurs or robber barons. So when you say robber barons, did they really, were they robbing and setting these monopolies, or were they actually helping society? So, but they were considered the expanded business and increased the profits and captains of industry. And they also provided thousands of jobs. And they stimulated other industries to start. And they provided to the world the much needed commodities and stuff that they made. And they made the world better, safer, and more enjoyable to mankind. Well, in a lot of ways they did. Philanthropy, they called it. Philanthropy means the love of mankind. Well, let's talk about Andrew Carnegie here. Now, Andrew Carnegie is not my favorite guy, as you say, as he definitely was not a Christian. He was an atheist. But in 1889, Andrew Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth, in which he stated his principles of good stewardship, what he thought towards mankind. There were many wealthy businesses tried to follow his example by voluntarily distributing surplus riches to build and maintain public institutions such as hospitals, libraries, and schools. So he did start a lot of hospitals, a lot of libraries, lots and lots of libraries and schools. And he even gave to some churches, like he gave churches and paid for their organs. He loved music and organ music, especially, I guess. But all those men, they were not Christians, but a lot of them set the stage for good stewardship in their monies, and Andrew Carnegie was one of those. Why do I say this? Well, he gave away most of his money. Let's just say that. So he basically saying the greatest material benefits for the greatest number of people. Carnegie, in 1889, he said, the excellent quality at affordable prices for the general public is what matters. And the poor now enjoy what the rich could not afford earlier, and luxuries now have become the necessities of life. The laborer has more comforts than a farmer a few generations ago, and farmers have more luxuries than their landlords ever had. And the better household and were richly clad with all of this beautiful clothing that they never had before. And the landlord now has books and pictures rarer than and more artistic than the kings could ever have. So what he was saying, look at us now. We have more than the people of the last few generations ever had. But if culture ceases to be good, so let's talk about that, because these robber barons could be definitely robber barons, huh? Because it all is the attitude of the heart. For the Bible says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. So it's that greed that could happen very easily in a time like this. So if culture ceases to be good, they will cease to be great. They will use their riches to degrade character rather than build it. Once men love money rather than God, they begin a course that leads to all kinds of evil. That's in 1 Timothy 6:10. John Wesley said, gain all you can, save all you can, but give all you can. And riches lead to God's blessing. The person under God's control will see every possession as a gift of God and will obey God by his giving. Adam Smith, this last part, and I'm going to talk about, it's in your book, Adam Smith and the Triumph of Capitalism. So he lived way back in 1723 to 1790. So we're talking about at least, 50 to 100 years before, the 1800s. He was a Scottish philosopher. He believed that mercantilism held the government control of the nation's trade through tariffs and regulations intended to feed the national treasury. What that means is the system that had mercantile system of back in the countries of Europe there, that basically the trade, they had to pay so many tariffs and taxes and regulations to the government instead of being having the freedom that we have under capitalism. Adam Smith called for an alternative system of free trade without government interference. The basic thing of capitalism, trade without government interference. In 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations for Individual Freedom and Economics that leads to the greatest good, not only for the individual, but the society as a whole. He said the best way to run a society as a whole is to be free. And that would lead to the greatest good, the freedom of interference from the government. Adam Smith's formula: free trade allows individual investors to put capital to the wisest use. In turn, the manufacturer would make his product the cheapest and the best. Adam Smith was one of the earliest advocates of capitalism or the free market. He saw political freedom and economic freedom and provided the best way of manufacturing and trade as in capitalism. If a man is not free to use his financial resources as he chooses, then he is not free. I like this at the bottom. He said, the real tragedy of the poor is the poverty of their aspirations. Basically saying, without a free market, without freedom to be what you want to be and to financially succeed, then where are your aspirations? You have nothing. You have no dream for the future. The rewards of competition. Rewards of diligent work with profits regulated by supply and demand and competition among producers and services. So the competition would actually keep the services and be able to keep the prices down. The people would benefit from this competition with greater quantity of goods, higher quality of goods, and lower prices. Smith based the ideas on the principles of human nature. So what are these principles of human nature? First of all, that most people are naturally concerned with improving their family's material wealth and well-being. Yes, we are concerned with our families. Government projects that eliminate a family's concern and interest in self-betterment lead to poverty and tyranny. When a government comes home and controls the family and doesn't allow them to succeed, then we have poverty and tyranny. Economic growth occurs when each family is free to make its own economic choices and decisions. In the long run, economic growth in a free economy improves material welfare of everyone because there must be accumulation of capital for any people to get beyond poverty state. So basically, people must have capital in the long run when they're free to gain capital, and gain this capital so that they can actually invest in more of their business. They can get out of the poverty state. Economic growth results in a larger number of property owners who see to it that their property is put to the best use and who seek greater political and economic freedom. So basically, Adam Smith felt like the free enterprise system would bring greater political freedom and greater economic freedom, and actually raise the economy of the total nation or the total country. Adam Smith's writings, he wrote The Wealth of Nations, and he saw wealth in a total new light. Perhaps for the first time in history, wealth was viewed not as something to be simply obtained and hoarded, but as capital to be invested in production. Adam Smith was largely responsible for the rise and triumph of the free enterprise system. So here we have it. You know, here the end of chapter 19 brings us into what is the difference between a society like ours with free enterprise that focus on what they call capitalism, because we have capital to invest. You know, we have extra money to invest and extra products to invest because we're not so controlled by the government. Now the government has to, you know, step in, you know, to keep order. We know that. We can't have a society that's crazy. So we know that it is important for our government to keep the law in order. But each individual should be free to pursue his dream, whether it's economically, spiritually, or, you know, physically, I should say, all ways, you know. So that's basically, and the opposite of a free enterprise is actually socialism and communism. When a country takes over all of the dreams and all the aspirations of the people and controls all of the property and owns everything and just tells individuals how to live and gives them the bare essentials, then that way you have very, very wealthy people or very wealthy tyrants controlling the largely poor population. So anyway, I hope you learned something from this. So we'll go on to the next chapter in a little bit.